I kept quiet when my daughter-in-law insulted me, but God made her eat those words. There are moments in life when silence becomes your only armor. Moments when words fail you, not because you don't have them, but because you know speaking will change nothing. I lived through such a moment, many moments actually, where my daughter-in-law's tongue cut deeper than any knife ever could. I didn't defend myself. I didn't shout back. I simply stood there, swallowing my pain like bitter medicine, trusting that somewhere beyond my understanding, justice was taking notes. And oh, my dear child, when truth finally spoke on my behalf, it roared so loud that even the deaf could hear it. Welcome, my dear. This is Grandma Alice Stories, where every tale carries a lesson and every wound carries wisdom. Sit close, grab your tea, and listen carefully, because today's story isn't just mine. It's for every soul who's ever been silenced by cruelty, who's ever swallowed their dignity to keep peace, who's ever wondered if staying quiet makes you weak. No, child. Sometimes silence is the loudest prayer God ever hears. It all began on a Sunday morning in spring, the kind of morning where the air smells like fresh rain and new beginnings. I woke early, as I always did, to prepare breakfast for my son Michael and his wife, Rebecca. They'd been married 3 years by then, and lived just 2 streets away from my little house, the same house where I raised Michael alone after his father passed. It wasn't much. Faded wallpaper, creaky wooden floors, a kitchen table that wobbled if you leaned too hard on one side. But it was filled with love. At least it used to be. I hummed an old hymn as I flipped pancakes on the stove, the same song I used to sing to Michael when he was a boy with scraped knees and big dreams. He was coming over for Sunday breakfast, a tradition we'd kept since he was old enough to walk. But this time, Rebecca was coming too. My heart fluttered with a mix of hope and unease. You see, Rebecca had never warmed to me. From the moment Michael introduced us, I saw it in her eyes. That cold, measuring look, as if she were calculating my worth and finding me lacking. Still, I tried. Lord knows I tried. I baked her favorite lemon cake. I asked about her work, her hobbies, her dreams. I complimented her beauty, her intelligence, her taste in everything. But kindness, I've learned, cannot soften a heart that's already decided you're beneath it. The doorbell rang at 9 sharp. I wiped my flour-dusted hands on my apron and hurried to answer, my smile ready and genuine. Michael stood there, tall and handsome in his Sunday shirt, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. Rebecca stood beside him, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension. Her hair was styled like she'd just stepped out of a magazine, and her perfume, expensive, overpowering, filled my small entryway before she even crossed the threshold. "Good morning, Mama," Michael said softly, kissing my cheek. His embrace was brief, careful, as if he were afraid of wrinkling something, though what, I couldn't say. "Morning, Alice," Rebecca said flatly, not bothering with any warmth. She never called me Mom or Mother, always Alice. Like I was some distant acquaintance she tolerated out of obligation. I led them to the dining table, where I'd set out my best china, chipped and mismatched, but clean and lovingly arranged. I'd made pancakes, scrambled eggs, bacon, fresh orange juice, and that lemon cake I stayed up late baking. Michael's eyes lit up when he saw the spread, a flicker of the boy he used to be. "Mama, this looks amazing," he said, pulling out a chair. Rebecca sat down without a word, her eyes scanning the table with barely concealed disdain. She picked up a fork, examined it like it might carry disease, then set it down with a soft clink that somehow felt loud in the quiet room. "So," I said brightly, desperate to fill the silence. "How has work been, Rebecca? Michael mentioned you got that promotion." She glanced at me, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Yes, I did. Managing director now. It's demanding, but the salary is, well, let's just say it's comfortable." "That's wonderful, dear. You must have worked so hard." "I did." Her eyes drifted around my small kitchen, taking in the faded curtains, the old refrigerator covered in Michael's childhood drawings I'd never had the heart to remove, the linoleum floor I'd scrubbed 1,000 times but could never make look new. Hard work pays off. That's what separates successful people from others. The pause before others felt deliberate. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "More pancakes, son?" I asked quickly, passing him the plate. "Thanks, Mama." He took 2, but I noticed he wasn't eating with his usual appetite. Rebecca picked at her food, moving it around her plate more than actually eating. Then she did something that made my heart sink. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through it at my table, during the meal I'd prepared with love. "Rebecca," Michael said gently, "maybe put the phone away?" "I'm checking emails," she replied without looking up. "Unlike some people, I don't have the luxury of a leisurely Sunday morning. Unlike some people." The words hung in the air like smoke. I swallowed hard and continued eating, though the pancakes suddenly tasted like cardboard in my mouth. I'd learned to let small cuts pass. Sometimes dignity means knowing which battles matter. But then she spoke again, and this time the cut went deeper. "You know, Alice," she said, finally setting her phone down and fixing me with those cold, appraising eyes. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." My hands stilled on my coffee cup. "Yes, dear. It's about Michael." She reached over and placed her manicured hand on his arm, a gesture of possession more than affection. "He's been stressed lately. The financial pressure is significant." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said carefully. "Is there anything I can help with?" She laughed. Actually laughed. A sound without warmth. "Help? Alice, no offense, but looking around this place." She gestured vaguely at my humble home. "I don't think you're in a position to help anyone financially." Michael's fork clattered against his plate. "Rebecca, that's not. I'm just being honest," she continued, her voice syrupy sweet but laced with poison. "I mean, Michael takes care of you, doesn't he? The monthly checks, the repairs on this house. Maybe if he didn't have to support 2 households, we could actually start building our future. Buy that house I want. Take those vacations. Live the life we deserve." The room went silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the clock my late husband bought me on our first anniversary. I looked at my son. His face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on his plate like it held the answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Michael gives me what he can," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest. "But I never ask for more than he offers. I worked my whole life, raised him alone, and now you're retired, living off his generosity." Rebecca interrupted, her smile sharp as glass. "I'm not saying you were a bad mother, Alice. I'm just saying maybe it's time to stop being a burden." Burden. That word landed in my heart like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of pain through every corner of my being. I opened my mouth, ready to defend myself, ready to remind her of the nights I worked double shifts to buy Michael's school books, the meals I skipped so he could eat, the dreams I buried so his could bloom. But then I saw my son's face, torn, ashamed, silent, and something inside me shifted. I closed my mouth. I set down my fork. I folded my hands in my lap, and I said nothing, because in that moment, I realized something profound. Some people don't deserve your words. Some people need to learn from something greater than your defense. They need to learn from life itself. Rebecca continued talking, her voice a blur of criticisms about my home, my clothes, my old-fashioned ways. Michael sat frozen, a statue of guilt and cowardice. And I simply listened, storing every word in a quiet corner of my heart. Not for revenge, but as a reminder that patience is sometimes the only power we have. When breakfast ended, early, strained, bitter, they left quickly. Michael kissed my cheek at the door, his eyes brimming with something that looked like apology, but he said nothing. Rebecca didn't even say goodbye. I closed the door behind them and stood in my small entryway, listening to their car drive away. My hands were shaking. My throat was tight. But I didn't cry. Not yet. That night, I sat in my favorite chair by the window, watching the moon rise over the quiet neighborhood. I thought about Rebecca's words, about being called a burden, about the way my son said nothing in my defense. And I prayed, not for revenge, not for her downfall. I prayed for strength, for wisdom, for the patience to let God handle what I could not. Because deep in my spirit, I felt something stirring, something that whispered this story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days after that Sunday breakfast felt heavier than usual. I went about my routines, watering my small garden, visiting the church on Wednesdays, calling my old friend Martha to chat over the phone. But something had shifted inside me. Rebecca's words played on repeat in my mind like a broken record. Burden, burden, burden. Each time I heard it echo in my thoughts, I had to pause, take a breath, and remind myself of who I really was. I wasn't a burden. I was a woman who'd sacrificed everything for her child. I was a woman who'd worked her fingers to the bone in that textile factory for 30 years. I was a woman who'd turned a house into a home with nothing but love and determination. But when someone you love stays silent while you're being torn down, it makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. Michael didn't call for 2 weeks. Not once. Usually, he'd phone me every few days just to check in, to hear my voice, to tell me about his day. But after that morning, my phone stayed silent. I told myself he was busy, that work was demanding, that married life required adjustments. But deep down, I knew. Rebecca had built a wall between us, brick by brick, and my son was too afraid or too blind to tear it down. It was Martha who finally got me talking. She came over on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a container of her famous peach cobbler and wearing that knowing look she'd perfected over 67 years of living. "All right, Alice," she said, settling into my kitchen chair with a groan. "What's eating at you? And don't tell me nothing, because I've known you since we were girls, and I can read you like yesterday's newspaper." I poured us both tea, my hands steadier than my heart. Then, slowly, I told her everything. About Rebecca's words. About Michael's silence. About feeling invisible in my own son's life. Martha listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup, her eyes sharp and understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "That girl's got a storm coming," she said simply. "Pride like that? It doesn't go unpunished. You just wait and see." "I'm not waiting for her to be punished, Martha," I said softly. "I just want my son back." "Oh, honey," Martha sighed. "Sometimes people have to lose their way completely before they can find their way home." Her words stayed with me long after she left. I wondered how lost Michael would have to get before he'd remember where home was. 3 weeks after that painful breakfast, my phone rang. It was late, almost 10 o'clock, and my heart jumped when I saw Michael's name on the screen. "Mama." His voice sounded strained, tight. "Can I come over?" "Of course, son. Are you all right?" There was a pause, heavy with something I couldn't name. I need to talk to you. I'll be there in 20 minutes." He arrived looking like he'd aged years in mere weeks. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He stood at my doorstep like a stranger unsure of his welcome, and it broke my heart to see him that way. "Come in, baby," I said, stepping aside. I'd never stopped calling him that, even though he was 32 years old and taller than his father ever was. We sat in the living room, the same room where I'd rocked him to sleep as a baby, where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd laughed and cried and built a life together after his daddy died. Now it felt like sacred ground we were both afraid to disturb. "Mama, I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice cracking. "About what Rebecca said. About how I just sat there." I reached for his hand. "Michael." "No, let me finish." He took a shaky breath. I've been a coward. She's been saying things about you for months. Little comments here and there. And I kept telling myself she'd come around, that she just needed time to get to know you. But that morning, he closed his eyes. That morning, when she called you a burden, I should have stood up. I should have defended you. Instead, I sat there like a fool and let her disrespect the woman who gave me everything. Tears rolled down his cheeks, and seeing my grown son cry brought tears to my own eyes. Why didn't you say anything? I asked gently. Because I'm afraid of her, he whispered, and the admission seemed to cost him everything. I'm afraid that if I disagree with her, if I don't give her what she wants, she'll leave. And I love her, Mama. I know she's not perfect, but I love her. My heart ached for him. This was the trap so many people fall into, loving someone who makes them smaller, who demands they choose between love and loyalty, who treats compromise like surrender. Son, I said carefully, love shouldn't make you afraid. Love shouldn't make you abandon the people who've loved you longest. Real love doesn't ask you to choose. It makes room for everyone who matters. He nodded, wiping his eyes. I know you're right, but she's under a lot of pressure at work. The promotion came with responsibilities, expectations. She's stressed, and when she's stressed, she takes it out on everything around her. I keep thinking once things settle down, she'll be different. I'd heard this story before, from friends, from women at church, from my own mother talking about my father in his darker days. Asterisk when things settle down, when he's less stressed, when circumstances change. Always waiting for the storm to pass, never realizing that some people are the storm. But I didn't say that. Instead, I held my son's hand and let him talk. Let him unburden himself in the only safe space he had left. What Michael told me that night painted a picture I'd only glimpsed before. Rebecca's promotion had changed her. The money, the power, the status, it had all gone to her head like strong wine. She'd started spending extravagantly, buying things they couldn't afford, demanding they move to a bigger house, insisting they vacation in places that required credit cards to be maxed out. She says it's about image, Michael explained. That, in her position, she needs to look successful. But Mama, we're drowning in debt. I work overtime every week, and it's still not enough. And when I suggest we slow down, he trailed off. She what? She compares me to her colleagues' husbands. Tells me I'm not ambitious enough. Says she settled when she married me. His voice dropped to a whisper. Sometimes I think she's right. Michael Anthony Walker, I said firmly, using his full name the way I did when he was young and needed to hear truth. You are not less than anyone. You work hard, you're honest, you have a good heart. Don't let anyone, not even your wife, make you believe otherwise. He looked at me with eyes so full of pain and confusion that I wanted to gather him in my arms like I did when he was 5 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. What do I do, Mama? It was the question I'd been dreading, because I knew my answer wouldn't be what he wanted to hear. You pray, I said softly. You pray for wisdom, for strength, and for clarity. And then you decide what kind of man you want to be, the kind who stands up for what's right or the kind who bends until he breaks. We talked until midnight, my son and I, in that little living room that held so many memories. When he finally left, he hugged me tighter than he had in years. I love you, Mama, he whispered. I love you too, baby. Always. I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the darkness. And as I closed the door, I felt it again. That stirring in my spirit, that sense of something building just beyond the horizon. I didn't know it then, but change was already in motion. Like a stone thrown into a pond, Rebecca's cruelty had created ripples that were spreading wider than either of us could see. And sometimes the universe doesn't wait for us to be ready. Sometimes it simply decides it's time. 2 months passed after that midnight conversation with Michael. 2 months where I prayed more than I'd ever prayed in my life. I prayed for my son's marriage, for Rebecca's heart to soften, for wisdom to know when to speak and when to stay silent. But mostly, I prayed for peace, the kind of peace that comes when you finally surrender control and trust that God's timing is better than your own. Michael visited more often after that night, though never when Rebecca was home from work. He'd stop by on his lunch breaks, bringing sandwiches we'd eat at my wobbly kitchen table, talking about everything except the elephant in the room. I could see the weight he carried, in the slope of his shoulders, in the tired lines around his eyes, in the way he'd sometimes stop mid-sentence and just stare at nothing, lost in thoughts he wouldn't share. I didn't push. I'd learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply being there, a quiet harbor in their storm. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, everything changed. I was in my garden, pulling up the last of the summer tomatoes, when I heard a car pull up fast in my driveway. The engine cut off abruptly, followed by the slam of a car door. I looked up, dirt on my hands and confusion in my heart, to see Rebecca walking toward me. But this wasn't the Rebecca I knew. Polished, composed, radiating superiority like expensive perfume. This Rebecca's hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her designer clothes were wrinkled. Her face, usually perfectly made up, was bare and blotchy, like she'd been crying for hours. "Alice," she said, and her voice cracked on my name. "I need to talk to you." I stood slowly, my old knees protesting, and brushed the dirt from my gardening gloves. "All right, dear. Come inside." She followed me into the house, and I noticed her hands were shaking as she sat at the kitchen table. The same table where she'd called me a burden, where she'd implied I was dragging my son down. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I kept my face neutral, kind even, as I put the kettle on for tea. "What's happened?" I asked gently. She stared at her hands for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I lost my job." I turned from the stove, surprise washing over me. "What?" "They fired me yesterday." She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "After everything I sacrificed, every weekend I worked, every relationship I neglected, every person I stepped on to climb that ladder, they just let me go. Budget cuts, they said. Last hired, first fired, despite my title." I brought the tea to the table and sat across from her, waiting. Sometimes people need silence more than they need words. "And it gets worse," she continued, tears now streaming down her face. "We're drowning in debt, Alice. The house we bought, the one I insisted we get, we can't afford the mortgage. The cars, the clothes, the vacations. It was all on credit. I was so sure my income would keep growing, that we'd always have enough. But now," she covered her face with her hands, "now I don't know what we're going to do." Part of me, the wounded part that still remembered her cruelty, wanted to feel vindicated. Wanted to say, "See? This is what happens when you value things over people." But when I looked at this broken woman crying in my kitchen, all I felt was compassion, because I'd been broken before too. I knew what it felt like when life humbled you in ways you never saw coming. "Have you told Michael?" I asked. "Yes, last night." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He was kind, too kind. After how I've treated him, how I've treated you, he should have been angry. But he just held me and said we'd figure it out together." "That's my son," I said softly. "He has his father's heart." Rebecca looked up at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something new in her eyes, shame, regret, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for everything, for the things I said, for how I treated you, for trying to push you out of Michael's life. You didn't deserve any of it." I took a sip of my tea, letting her words settle between us. "Why did you do it, Rebecca? Why did you hate me so much?" She was quiet for a long time, wrestling with something inside herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw with honesty. "Because you reminded me of everything I was running from," she said. "I grew up poor, Alice. Really poor. My mother cleaned houses for rich people, and my father, he was never around. I wore hand-me-downs, went to school hungry, got mocked by kids who had everything I didn't. So I promised myself I'd never be like my mother. Never be someone people looked down on. Never be poor again. Never be powerless. She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. When I met Michael and saw where he came from, saw this house, saw you living simply, it terrified me, because I saw my mother. I saw the life I'd spent years escaping. And instead of recognizing your strength, your dignity, your love, I only saw poverty. And I hated it. I hated the reminder. So I tried to make you small, to push you away, to convince Michael that we needed to cut ties with anything that looked like struggle. Tears were falling freely now, dropping into her untouched tea. But the joke's on me, isn't it? She laughed bitterly. Because now I'm right back where I started. No job, no savings, no security. All that running, and I ended up exactly where I feared. I reached across the table and took her hand. The same hand that had gestured dismissively at my home, that had worn rings worth more than my monthly pension, that had pushed my son away from me. I held it gently, the way I'd hold any broken thing that needed mending. Rebecca, I said quietly, poverty isn't about how much money you have. It's about how empty your heart is. I've been broke, yes, but I've never been poor. Because I've always been rich in the things that matter. Love, faith, family. Those are the things that hold you when everything else falls apart. She sobbed then, really sobbed, her shoulders shaking with the weight of everything she'd been carrying. And I got up, walked around the table and held her. This woman who'd wounded me, who'd tried to erase me from my son's life, who'd built walls where there should have been bridges. I held her because that's what you do when someone finally breaks open enough to see their own brokenness. I'm so sorry, she whispered against my shoulder. I'm so sorry. I know, child. I know. We stayed like that for a long time. Two women from different worlds finding common ground in the ruins of pride and pain. When Michael came home that evening, they'd had to give up their expensive apartment and were temporarily staying with friends. He found us together in my kitchen. Rebecca was helping me prepare dinner, moving awkwardly around my small space, asking questions about recipes and measurements like a student eager to learn. The look on my son's face when he saw us, his mother and his wife side by side, no longer enemies, was worth every insult I'd endured, every tear I'd cried in silence, every prayer I'd whispered in the dark. Mama, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I smiled at him, my beautiful boy who'd finally learned what real strength looked like. Set the table, son. We're having pot roast tonight. Your favorite. As we sat together, three people who'd walked through fire and somehow found each other on the other side. I felt that stirring in my spirit again. But this time, it wasn't foreboding. It was peace. The kind of peace that comes when justice and mercy shake hands. When silence proves louder than any defense. When God finishes the battles you were wise enough not to fight. That night, after they left, I sat in my chair by the window and thought about everything that had happened. Rebecca's fall from grace wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation. Sometimes people need to lose everything to discover what truly matters. And me, I'd learned something too. I'd learned that keeping quiet doesn't make you weak. Sometimes it makes you wise enough to let life teach the lessons your words never could. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Grandma Alice Stories for more tales of wisdom, patience, and life's poetic justice. Hit that bell so you never miss a story. And remember, dear ones, what goes around always comes around. Always.